Hello and welcome to today's Student Success Workshop on studying. So studying well equals test success, and how can I be more effective when I study? So let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Raquel Lado. I work here at Algoma University on our main campus in the Learning Center. I'm a learning strategist, so I work with students to help them develop their own learning strategies to help them be more effective in the classroom. And studying well, of course, is a very, very important area to develop learning strategies in, because you have a lot of grades that are based primarily on your tests and exams. So studying is very, very important. It's important to know how to do it well. All right, so I'm going to start off with some questions just for you to think about as we go through. So how do you study now? So being honest with yourself, are you studying as well as you could be? I hear a lot of students say, they procrastinate, they don't put in enough time, they're distracted, they're not active enough in their studying. What areas need some work? And then are you getting the results you want? So ultimately, are the test and exam grades that you're getting honestly reflective of your ability? Or are they maybe lower because you didn't actually put in the time you needed to study, or whatever? So, are you getting the results you want? Okay, so before we get into really too much detail about studying, we need to talk a little bit about what memory is. So we have two types of memory, short-term and long-term, that we're going to talk about. And so our short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, which is not a lot, okay? And it's also in our mind for only a short period of time, okay? Long-term memory is different. Long-term memory is, we use the word, it's infinite. There really is no stopping. There's no limit to what we can remember. But we have to do something to get information from our short-term memory when we're first introduced to it into our long-term memory. And that really, I guess we could say, is the goal of studying. Is taking information I'm hearing or seeing for the first time, doing something with it so that it's going to be in my long-term memory. And then it's going to be there when I need it. I'm going to be able to retrieve it. So we're going to talk about some strategies to help that process. So what can we do? Well, we repeat information, right? We know that the more we say it, the more we read it, the more we're likely to remember it. We want to make it relevant, we want to make it meaningful, or we want to associate it with something. And we need to, this is really important, to keep the information recent, as in we have to use it frequently. So in the other workshops I've done, especially the one about note-taking, I talk about how valuable it can be to spend a little bit of time every week reviewing your class notes from previous lectures. And I don't mean getting into what I'm talking about here, the act of studying, but I mean just pulling out those notes, what did we do last week, reading it over, and keeping it a little bit more fresh in your mind. Because if you don't do that, when you come to the exam, you've had 3 months of class, times 5, because you've had 5 classes, and you're not going to remember what happened in the beginning of the semester, because you haven't used it, right? So spending a little bit of time reading over your notes throughout the semester is a small step, but it can save you a huge amount of time later. Okay? So anyway, keeping the information recent is very important. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 types of learners here, active and passive learners, before I get into the actual study part of it, because being an active learner throughout the whole semester is going to actually reduce the amount of time you have to study, because you've been engaged in your learning all along, so now you're not relearning everything, okay? Being a passive learner means that most likely, in all reality, by the time you get to the exam, you have not really been engaged in your class and you probably remember almost nothing. So then you kind of have to start from the beginning. Okay? So, what type of learner are you? Now I have a chart, and I realize that with the videotaping this may not show up very well, so I'm going to probably read most of it. So we've got the 2 types of learners, passive and active. Okay? So the first task is class lectures. So a passive student tries to write everything that the professor says without actually really thinking about what they're talking about. It's sort of, I just have to copy it down as fast as I can. On the other side of that, and it doesn't say this here, is passive learners tend to also write nothing. They just sit there. They're on Facebook in class. They're texting their friends. They're not even really listening to the class. Or what they're doing is they're relying on PowerPoints. And again, I talk about this in a note-taking workshop. It's great that many professors, like I do, provide you with a PowerPoint. But this is not everything. You need to be supplementing this. This is only sort of a guide for the professor. Okay? So an active learner is listening to the professor, paying attention and focusing, okay? Deciding what is important. Do I need to write this down? Yes or no? And then, how can I best write it? How can I put it in my own words so I'm not just copying the words the professor's using? That means I've had to think about it. In order for me to go through that process, I've had to actually think about what is this information and how can I write it down. Okay? So active learners are involved much more with their note-taking than passive learners are. Okay? The next one on the list is textbook reading. Now, in the reading workshop I do, I stress how important it is to get the reading done before class. You have a reading schedule in your course outline, and the goal is that the reading is done before the class begins. Now, passive learners, probably many of them just don't do the reading at all, but when they do read, okay, what it says here is that they're moving their eyes from line to line down the page, then they get bored, they fall asleep, they forget what they've read by the time they get to the end of the paragraph or the page. So they put in time, but really at the end of it, they have nothing to show for the time, because they don't actually remember much of what they learned, right? So an active learner is reading, thinking about what they're reading, underlining key concepts. So they're reading a paragraph or a section, reflecting back on it, and thinking, what was the most important part there? Should I underline something? Should I highlight something? They're creating questions. What is it that I read? Do I understand this? What was this? How does this link to this? So the next point, trying to link ideas. Creating a structure for the topic. Mapping out that structure and summarizing their own words or in a table form. Now, obviously, being an active reader is going to take a lot more time. But at the end of it, you're much more likely to actually remember what you read. And then you're going to probably have some sort of notes that you've created while you're reading that then you use for studying later. So it's putting in a bit more time every week, but again, it's going to reduce the amount of time you have to spend studying later. Now, in terms of studying, and this is where we're going to concentrate more on today, passive students do a lot of rereading. They reread notes, they reread textbooks, they reread handouts over and over. They don't really think about them, but they read them a lot. Active learners are organizing study materials, they're looking at topics and themes, they're making outlines, graphs, charts, diagrams, they're looking for patterns or trends, figuring out possible exam questions, that's so important. They're looking for comparisons or contrasts. So it's not just I'm just going to reread this over. I'm going to try and work with it and manipulate it somehow that I can create some study notes, I'm going to think like a professor, and we're going to go into more detail about that. In terms of written class assignments, passive learners do the bare minimum, right? 4 to 6 pages, I'm handing in 4. That's it. Active learners, they're discovering the purpose and significance of the assignment, they're identifying key concepts and principles, they're gaining knowledge, and it also doesn't say this here, but they're linking it back to what's happening in class. A professor would not hand you an assignment to do worth 1/4 of your mark, 25% of your mark, if that professor didn't feel that that had a lot of value to what the class was. They wouldn't do that because they have to mark it, right? It's a lot of work on their part for assignments, it's a lot. So if they're doing and giving you an assignment, to them there's a lot of value in it, okay? And then in terms of learning material, which really ties in with studying, a passive student focuses a lot on memorizing. And I'm going to talk more about this later. Memorizing, they're interested only in grades, they give up easily when work is difficult, whereas active learners use meaningful memory skills, don't give up easily, are interested in the challenge of learning, and believe in working hard to achieve success. So the goal is, and no one's perfect, there's no perfect student, but the goal is to be an active learner throughout the whole semester. So that when it comes time to study for exams, you're a big step ahead. Because you're going to remember a lot more, you're going to understand a lot more, and it's going to make it a lot easier to study. But anyway, today is a study workshop, so now we're going to get into the particulars of study. Okay, so we want studying to be an ongoing process. In a perfect world, that's what happens, okay? We periodically review our class notes, we keep the ideas fresh in our mind, and then we start studying early. Studying takes a lot of time. When you think of all the information you're given in a semester, and you want to process that information and understand it, it does take quite a bit of time. Okay, the study environment. I think this is really important. Where are you going to do your studying? You have lots of options, right? It can be at home. And what is home? Is home in a family home? Is home your own apartment? Is home residence? You can come to the school, but even still, where are you coming at the school? Are you going to the quiet floor of the library in a study carrel? Are you trying to study in the speakeasy at lunchtime, right? So where is that environment going to be for you that you're going to study? And it really is important, and it's a way to help eliminate distractions. Also, find your optimal amount of study time and work with that. Studying effectively really takes a lot out of you. It takes a lot of mental focus. And that can be tiring. So when I say find your optimal amount of study time with that, to me what that means is, how long are you good for? Can you sit, let's say, for an hour and really, like, your brain is on fire, you can really focus for an hour? Or are you only good for half an hour? There's no right or wrong. But I always say, if your brain is only good to keep you paying attention and focus for an hour, but you make yourself sit there for 3, you probably just wasted 2 hours, right? You would have been far better off to really work hard for an hour, take a 15-20 minute break, and then come back again and work. Okay? So when you find that you're starting to stare off into space, right? Or you're reading the same paragraph over and over and no idea what you read, you might actually fall asleep. You know, whatever it is, take a break. There's no point making yourself go on. Take a break, okay? And then come back to it. In terms of studying for exams, some students find creating a structured schedule works well. So that's looking at your exams. When are they? How are they spread out? And when am I going to study for each? Do I have exams that are back-to-back that I have to study for 2 at the same time? Or am I fortunate enough that I have an exam and then it's like 4 or 5 days until the next exam? So then I don't have to worry about 2 at the same time, right? So your exam schedule is going to be different for everybody. But it's really important that you look at that and figure out your study schedule. How am I going to handle this? Especially when you have maybe like a night exam at 7 and then you have one the next day at 9 a.m., right? Because then you have 0 time in between the 2. So you really need to look at that and figure out, how am I going to do this so that I can get the studying in that I need to, as well as keeping myself sane, pretty much. So try and create a schedule and stick to it. This goes back to where I said, where are you studying? Sit at a desk or table. No beds. Beds are for sleeping and relaxing and being lazy. They are not conducive to studying, okay? And I don't have this written down here, but actually get up and get out of your pajamas. Studies have shown that we are more effective when we get up, get dressed. It creates a mental mindset, I'm ready to start the day, I'm ready to do this, compared to just lounging around in your pajamas. Every little bit helps. That's the way I think, right? And then eliminate distractions. And this is huge. For many students, this is the biggest sort of pitfall of studying, is the distractions. The cell phones, Facebook, YouTube, all those other things. Sometimes you just have to be stern with yourself. You have to turn them off. You have to walk away from the computer if you don't need a computer to help you study. And this is what then breaks become, right? So I'm going to turn my phone off for an hour. I'm turning off the computer for an hour, and I'm going over these PowerPoints and notes from the professor, and I'm pulling out the important parts, and after an hour, then I'm taking a 20-minute break. And that's when then I turn my cell phone back on, and I respond to the text, and I go get a coffee and everything else. And I shut it down again, and I get back to work. Your friends and family should understand how important this is, right? And if you are not accessible for an hour or 2, the world doesn't end. They should be okay with that. Because really, you have to make your priority, right? And that's going to be doing well on these exams. You need to put in the time to study. We're not good at multitasking. Okay, making study notes. You cannot study everything. You don't need to study everything. So, go through your class notes, identify things that you feel you must know. So, you look for key definitions, concepts, important people, in history classes, for example, dates, whatever it might be. Go through and identify, I'm pretty sure I need to study all these things. Look at your textbook. Is there any information in your textbook that you're pretty sure is going to be on the exam that you want to study? Now, how do you know what you should study? You think back to what happened in class. How much time did the professor spend on something? Did they repeat things? And this is where note-taking can be very helpful. So when I was in university, when I was taking notes, if the professor, like spent 3/4 of a class on one concept, well, that's a lot of time, which means I'm probably going to see it again on an exam. So what I would do is on my notes is I would put a big star beside it. And then I would know later when I went back and looked through my notes, anything that I had marked with a star at that moment, I really need to make sure I study that. So it's just a simple way of sort of flagging things that you can come back to after. Okay? So you end up with your study notes. Sometimes we don't make the right choices. And I remember in university sometimes doing this, thinking, you know what, I don't think I need to study this. The professor hardly talked about it. He or she spent so much more time on this or whatever. And you make a judgment call, and then sometimes you find out it was the wrong one. And it happens. But this goes back to what I said about being an active student. If you're an active student all throughout the semester, right, and you're paying attention in class, you're taking good notes, you're doing your reading, you're engaged, even though you didn't sit down and really, really study it, you should have some sense of it. Not enough maybe to get full marks, but enough that you can put something down so that you can get part marks, right? You can use logic. You can use what do I remember. Maybe this isn't exactly it, but I'm going to throw it down anyway, right? A half mark is better than no mark. So sometimes you just make the wrong decision, and then you do the best you can at that moment. Sometimes too, there's clues hidden throughout the rest of the test. That's always nice when that happens. Okay, so decide on a format to create your study notes. Now, I don't mean that they have to be like highly organized. So you can handwrite them, you can type them, whatever. It can be a linear progression, sort of like an outline, like 3 points I need to remember. It can be a concept map, right? This causes this, and so on. Maybe it's going to be some charts and graphs. Maybe it's a combination of different styles. There's no right or wrong here. But what you want to make sure is that you have headings and subheadings. And the reason to me that this is so important is because university is not about the regurgitation of memorized independent facts. That generally you're not going to have that type of testing, right? Now there's some first-year psychology classes that have a lot of students in them, and they do have, a lot more multiple choice. But as soon as you sort of get out of those classes, that's not what you have anymore. You have a lot of short answers. You have a lot of essay questions. In business, you have like actual cases, right? Like you're actually doing something. In accounting and so on, you have actual problems you need to solve. So what headings and subheadings do is they give you an idea of how things link together, right? So here is my sort of major heading. Here are the points under it. All of this works together. And things like that become really good essay questions, right? When you think you have a 25-mark question, that's a lot of information you have to put down. So it's not going to be the little parts down here. It's going to be the whole big thing, right? So you want your study notes to reflect that. You don't want your study notes to be you writing down a bunch of independent definitions and facts and striving to memorize them. Because that's not going to help you on a short answer question or an essay question. And so think about how you want, it doesn't really matter how they look as long as you can sort of see that. What are the big ideas? What are the smaller parts of the big ideas? How do the small parts work together with the big parts? Okay? So flashcards. So lots of students like flashcards. Now there's nothing wrong with flashcards, okay? But what they do is it becomes very difficult to get into the big picture things with flashcards. But if you have a class, and this is going to be more of like a first-year class, where you do tend to have more of the definitions and that type of thing, then flashcards can be helpful in that situation. Only that they're very active, right? You can work through them. Or for formulas, if there's a handful of formulas you need to remember, they can be really good for things like that too. So you're not going to be using flashcards as your only way to study, but they certainly have their value, I think, for in smaller sections for smaller things. Okay? And then there's lots of websites that there's free flashcards too on key definitions and so on. Okay, so study notes points to remember. Be active. Do not just copy the words. Copying is about as passive as you get. Here's some information, and I write it down exactly, and I don't even have to think about it, right? So that's not what you're doing with your study notes. You're thinking about the concept, you're trying to rewrite it in your own words. Here's a very simple test. If you're looking at a concept, whatever class it is, whatever subject, and you say, okay, How can I say that in my own words? And then you get that feeling of, oh, I know it, but I just can't really say it. You don't know well enough. It's a simple test. Because when you have to write that down on a test, you can't write, well, I know it, I just can't put it into words. No, you have to be able to do it, right? So you need to be asking yourself continually, can I put this in my own words? Create relationships between ideas. As I already said, don't just focus on all those independent pieces of information. Organize the information in a way that makes sense to you. Ultimately, your understanding is what is important. So the professor may have given something out a certain way, and you take that information and you actually turn it into a chart. And that chart makes perfect sense for you and it helps you understand. That's great. Okay, you don't just have to study things the way it's presented to you. Change it up so it works for you, okay? Because you're far more apt to remember it that way. Okay, so studying your study notes. So you go through, you create study notes, you think about things, you rewrite, you come up with a batch of paper maybe, or you type it out, whatever. That in itself is studying. You've already done a lot of studying because you've been so active with making your study notes. But then we get down to the nitty-gritty, right? I gotta get this in my long-term memory. Okay, so start with one section at a time. Don't overwhelm yourself. One section at a time. So you read it. You think about it. You reword it. How can I say this in my own words? You relate it to your life. That doesn't apply for everything, but sometimes if you can make a connection in your own life, you've made it relevant and meaningful, and you're more apt to remember it. And I know this sounds weird, recite it out loud a few times. So this may be something you do in a group, or even on your own. So it can be something like, okay, so let's just say you needed to remember something about memory that I put on here. Okay, long-term memory is infinite, moving information from short-term to long-term memory, repeat it, okay? And you actually say it out loud. And the reason why to me personally, I used to do this and I find it helpful, is that when I read something in my head, I can still think about something else. But when I'm reading it and actually reading it out loud and listening to myself, I'm not smart enough to do that and still think about something else. So it makes me focus a lot more, okay? And that helps with eliminating distractions, right? So actually say it out loud. Now some people find that working, like having a study partner is very, very helpful because of the talking, right? And the talking it out. And that's very good for a lot of people. Some people find it doesn't help because they get too social and they don't actually get much studying done. They sort of disintegrate into a social chit chat. I was sort of guilty of that too at university, but anyway. But speaking it out loud really helps. Okay, so really process the information to help move it into your long-term memory and keep actively reviewing. You do have to go over it and over it, okay? But by being active, we can sort of reduce the amount of times we have to go over it and over it. Okay, understanding versus memorizing. You need to understand the information and not just memorize it, so you can recognize it in different situations. So I was talking about a former student that I knew that had to take a class in organizational behavior. And this was at Sioux College, and I really don't even know why he had to take it. To me, it had nothing to do with this program whatsoever. But it was a requirement, and he didn't get it. He just didn't get the class. So anyway, he was a hard worker. And so the exam came around, and he studied, and he studied, and he studied, like days and days and days. And so he did the exam. I said, how did it go? He's like, I don't think it went very well. Got it back, and he failed it. And I'm like, Ian, what happened? Like, I know you put in so much time. So what he had done is because he didn't, ultimately comes down to this, he didn't understand the information. So he focused on memorizing. But what happened was, the situation in which it was presented was a scenario. So so-and-so is in an office, and blah, blah, blah happens, and this, and this, and this. What is this an example of? Because he didn't understand it, he had no clue how to answer the questions. Had it been multiple choice, like, this is this, A, B, C, he probably would have done really well, okay? And that's why memorizing is important, but it's not your only thing. You have to be able to understand the information so you can recognize it no matter how it's given to you. And because university is not about that regurgitation of those memorized facts, you need to understand it. And it's going to come out on a test if you don't, usually, okay? So if you don't understand, what can you do? Well, you can review the textbook. You can review your class notes, right? Look for different examples. Ask someone, anyone. Try to find more information from different sources. So what I do here is, I say to students, if you're looking at a concept and you don't understand it, you've tried these things, you don't get it, go on to Google and Google it. And you're going to get, you know, like 1,000 different websites. But go through those until you find one that explains it in a way that you understand. Just because you don't understand the words an author used in a textbook, it doesn't mean you can't understand the concept. You just need it explained a different way. And an example is a student that in a history class was looking at the consequences of the Civil War, and so he wanted to do a paper on it, but he needed some background information first, and he actually used a grade 5 history website that very clearly in very plain English outlined the consequences of the Civil War. And he's like, perfect. That's what I needed. I needed that general information, so now I can go on to the more advanced information. But I can't get the advanced information without the general base, right? So sometimes you just need to go and find it explained in an easier way to get the base. Then when you got it, you can go back to the more advanced, higher level of vocabulary and so on, okay? So there's different things you can do if you don't understand. Now, mnemonics. Mnemonics are memory tricks. We in Canada, one that we learn is every good boy deserves fudge as a way to help remember the musical notes, right? AGBDF. In terms of our directions, I learned never eat shredded wheat, right? For north, east, south, and west. So those are called mnemonics. And mnemonics can be a good way to help you remember a specific list. Or, yeah, actually a list is probably the best example. That's when they usually work the best, okay? You certainly are not using mnemonics for everything, not at all. But there's certainly some times where they work. So what you do is you look at what you need to remember and you create a sentence or a word with the beginning letters. So let's look at an example. So in first year psychology, for example, you may learn about Erik Erikson and the developmental stages that we go through in life. So they are infancy, toddler, early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, old age. So from a studying aspect, I can see this as being a very good short answer question. List Erik Erikson's developmental stages and give one example of something that happens in each. Okay? But here is a list where the order is really important. Not only do you need to remember them exactly, but you have to remember them in order, right? So this is an example where a mnemonic might be helpful. Now, one of my degrees is in psychology, and I use this as an example because I still remember my mnemonic. And it was, I teach education mainly at Eastview's main office. Now, I was in concurrent education, so using an education thing worked well for me. Eastview is a school that I didn't go to, but it's actually close to my home. So putting the name of Eastview in there made sense to me. That mnemonic wouldn't work for anybody else, right? But I still remember it, and I graduated a long time ago. And so what you do is you just look at the first letters, and you think, what can I do with that to help me remember? Now, also here, these first letters spell a word, item. So instead of coming up with a sentence, the whole half, if you remember item, you at least got the first half, right? And then go from there. So mnemonics to me, and I know not everybody likes mnemonics, and I've heard professors say, you know, they don't work, but what I like about them is they're very active, because you're doing something, and that to me, I think, is the whole point. I'm looking at this, I'm determining I need to know it, I'm looking at the first letters, I'm figuring out a way to help me remember, and then I'm practicing it. I is infancy, T is toddler, and in a very short time, I can remember this, compared to me just rereading it over and over again. So they don't work for everything, but when you do have a list, they can sometimes be very, very helpful. So thinking like a professor, while studying, ask yourself, what would be a good test question here? What is the most important piece of information that I need to know? Think about the type of test and the types of questions, and that's not a secret. Typically, you're going to know well in advance, right? You're going to have so many short answer questions. You're going to be, you're going to just be doing a case, so you need to know the case format. You're going to be whatever. Generally, the professor lets you know that ahead of time. So if you know that you have 3 essay questions, you need to look at the big picture, right? What's going to make an essay question? What's going to make a good short answer question? So I'm a big fan of practice tests. So you do them a couple days before your actual test, and then do another one 24 hours before. So you create a practice test by looking at your study notes, creating some questions, putting everything away, and you sit down and do your own test. And if you can do that, the information is in your long-term memory, because short-term memory is not long enough to carry you through, right? And it's not about, you don't fail your own practice test. All it is a way to let you know what's in my long-term memory and what do I need to work on. So it's just a way of condensing. I've got this, I've got this, I've got this, and then here's the couple things I still need to work on. Okay? So they can be very, very helpful. So when it's actually test time, okay, so you've done the studying to the best you can, be calm and be positive. We believe what we tell ourselves. If you walk into that exam saying, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I didn't study enough, I don't know anything, I'm going to fail,